Chapter 33. Someone was watching them. Horace didn't know how he knew. He simply knew. Some sixth sense, the same extra sense that had kept him alive in a dozen combats, told him that someone was watching. He thought he'd sensed a presence on the previous day when Will had left. Today, he was sure of it. He continued to move around the campsite, attending to the chores that needed his attention. He cleaned his breakfast utensils and the frying pan he'd used, scouring them with sand and then rinsing them clean in a bucket of clear water from the pond. Halt was still asleep, and he seemed to be resting easily. Horace thought he preferred Halt that way, compared to the way he had been, mistaking Horace for Crowley and talking about a long-ago battle with bandits. There had been something decidedly unnerving about that. It forced him to acknowledge the fact that Halt was seriously ill, even close to death. The sight of him resting peacefully was more encouraging. He could believe, or at least he could hope, that the ranger was actually recovering from the effects of the poison. Logically, he knew that it was only a matter of time before Halt woke again and rambled on about events long past. But hope doesn't always follow logic, and he clung to it desperately. Besides, there was the small matter of someone watching them. That would need to be addressed before too long. He assessed the situation. He knew it would be a mistake to let the watcher know that he had been detected. But here in the open, there was no way he could scan the surrounding countryside to search for some sign of the observer without alerting him. The odds were that the unknown watcher was somewhere on the ridge to the southeast, the direction in which Tennyson and his group had been travelling. That, after all, was the direction of greatest danger. Of course, it could be someone who had no connection to their present situation, a random traveller who had crossed their trail, or perhaps a robber waiting his chance to steal into the camp, assessing his chances against the strangers, measuring their strengths and weaknesses. But the greater likelihood was that they were being observed by one of Tennyson's followers. And if that were so, it would most likely be the surviving Genovesan. For a moment, his flesh crawled at the thought of a crossbowman lying hidden somewhere out there. Then he relaxed. The low ridge was over 300 meters away, and Will had told him that the Genovezans were armed with relatively low-powered crossbows. Maximum accurate range couldn't be more than 150 meters. But still, the thought that he was being watched rankled. It was like an itch that he couldn't reach to scratch. He glanced casually around the surrounding terrain. The nearest cover where he could scan the horizon without being seen was by the pond, some 50 meters away. It was in a depression in the ground, and there were several trees and bushes growing beside the water. From there, he could easily find a concealed observation point. The only problem was, he had already fetched fresh water for the camp. It had been his first task of the morning, before he became aware of the eyes upon him. The watcher might not have been there at the time, but if he had, he would wonder why Horace was fetching water again so soon. And if he started to wonder, he'd grow suspicious. Then he'd either move off or move against them, and Horace wasn't ready for either of those alternatives. He wanted to know who was out there, and why. He wished Will was back, but the earliest he could expect him would be the next day, assuming he'd been able to maintain the pace he had planned on. An idea struck him. He moved to the fire and selected a few medium-sized branches from the pile of firewood. Adding them to the fire, he turned away and kicked against the full bucket of water. It lurched sideways, and he stooped quickly, as if trying to prevent it tipping. In reality, he finished the job, shoving the bucket over onto its side, spilling the water. Some of the water ran into the freshly replenished fire, creating a plume of steam and smoke that would be easily visible to the observer. Just to make sure he got the full picture, Horace aimed a kick at the bucket, sending it spinning away, and said in a loud voice, "Damn it!" He was rather proud of that bit of byplay. He recalled a conversation at Castle Araluen some months prior with a member of a touring acting company. The actor had advised Horace to take a seat a little way down the hall for their performance, not right at the front. "We have to play to the back of the house," he had explained, "so our expressions and gestures are somewhat larger than life. Sit too close, and it becomes unrealistic." At the time, Horace had thought he was simply creating an excuse for what seemed to be excessive overacting. But now he saw the sense of it. "I certainly played to the back of the house then," he thought with grim satisfaction. Halt had stirred and murmured briefly when Horace swore and kicked at the offending bucket. Horace checked on him now, reassuring himself that the ranger had settled. He winced as he moved. His toe was bruised from the solid contact with the bucket, and he knew it would ache for a day or two. He shrugged philosophically. Sometimes an actor had to suffer for his art. He moved to retrieve the bucket then, walking through the camp. He bent quickly to his pack and picked up his sword and scabbard, holding them close against his side, out of sight. With any luck, the distant watcher wouldn't have seen what he picked up. Trying to look casual, he strolled across the grass to the pond. He walked down the shallow incline to the bank, dropping below ground level as he did so. As soon as the horizon was concealed from his sight, and, by the same token, he was concealed from anyone watching from there, he went into a crouch and placed the bucket on the ground. Staying in the crouch, he moved quickly to the cover of the trees and bushes, where he dropped belly down on the ground. Pushing himself along on elbows and knees, he squirmed carefully through the undergrowth until he could see the distant ridge. He began to scan it carefully, dividing it into sectors and searching methodically back and forth, keeping his eyes moving so they wouldn't become fixed to one focus. It took a couple of minutes, but finally he saw a quick movement. He caught it with his peripheral vision, then swung his eyes and focused on it. The watcher had edged forward. Perhaps after Horace had dropped from sight, he was trying to find a better vantage point to catch sight of the young warrior again. Now his head and shoulders were visible above the ridgeline. If he hadn't seen that small movement, chances are Horace would never have noticed. But now he could see the shape clearly, and he fancied he could also see a faint tinge of dull purple. "So, you've come back, have you?" he muttered. He glanced around, searching the surrounding countryside, looking for a way he could approach the watcher without being seen. "I need a gully or a stretch of dead ground somewhere," he said to himself. But he could see no such feature in the land between him and the ridge. Ruefully, he decided that if he were a ranger, he would have the skill to ghost forward unseen and unheard through the long grass. But even though Halt had given him a camouflage cloak, he knew the task was beyond him. And the thought of approaching an expert crossbowman across open ground was not an inviting one. Besides, it would take too long. The Genovesan would be expecting him to reappear in the next few minutes, heading back to the campsite with a replenished water bucket. If he became suspicious, who knew what his next action might be? No, Horace decided. Since he couldn't get close to the man, it was best to pretend he hadn't spotted him. It would be a sleepless night tonight, he thought. He retrieved the bucket and, at the last moment, remembered to refill it. His mind was so preoccupied with the problem of the watching Genovesan that he nearly forgot that small detail. If he'd had to make a return trip, That would really have roused the observer's suspicion, he thought. When he arrived back at the camp, the problem of the hidden watcher was pushed from his mind for a few minutes. He was delighted and surprised to find Halt awake and lucid. As they talked, it became apparent that Halt knew where they were and what had happened. He no longer mistook Horace for Crowley, and his mind was well and truly back in the present. His throat was dry, however, and Horace fetched him a cup of coffee. He could see the colour flowing back into Halt's face as he drank the reviving beverage. After a few appreciative sips, Halt looked around the neat campsite. "Where's Will? I assume he's gone on after Tennyson." Horace shook his head. "He's gone to fetch Malcolm," he replied, and as Halt momentarily puzzled over the name, he added, "The healer." That brought a frown of disapproval to Halt's face, and he shook his head. "He shouldn't have done that. He should have left me to my own devices and followed the outsiders. They'll be miles away by now. How long did you say I've been unconscious?" "Tomorrow will be the 3rd day," Horace said, and the frown on Halt's face deepened. "That's too big a lead to give them. They could give you the slip. He shouldn't have wasted time going after Malcolm." Horace noted the phrase, "they could give you the slip." Obviously, Halt had ruled himself out of further action against the outsiders. He hesitated, wondering whether to tell him about the Genovesan who had been keeping watch on them. If the Genovesan was reporting back to Tennyson, the outsiders couldn't be too far away, he thought. But he decided, on balance, it might be better not to trouble Halt with the news that they were being observed. Instead, he replied, "Would you have done that in his place? Would you have left him and gone on?" "Of course I would," Halt replied immediately. But something in his voice rang false, and Horace looked at him, raising one eyebrow. He'd waited a long time for an opportunity to use that expression of disbelief to Halt. After a pause, the ranger's anger subsided. "All right, perhaps I wouldn't," he admitted. Then he glared at Horace. "And stop raising that eyebrow at me. You can't even do it properly. Your other eyebrow moves with it." "Yes, Halt," said Horace in a mock subservient tone. He felt an indescribable tide of relief sweeping over him now that Halt seemed to be getting back to normal. Perhaps they wouldn't need Malcolm after all, he thought. He fixed Halt a light meal of broth and damper. At first, he tried to feed the grey-bearded ranger. Halt's indignant refusal lightened his spirits even more. "I'm not an invalid. Give me that damned spoon," the ranger said, and Horace turned away to hide his grin. That was more like the lovable Halt of old, he thought. Late in the afternoon, with Halt sleeping calmly, he became aware of a strange sensation, or, more correctly, a lack of sensation. Since the morning, he had felt the constant scrutiny of the Genovesan's eyes. Now suddenly, the feeling was gone. With apparent casualness, he scanned the horizon around the camp. He knew where the Genovesan had lain up during the day. Several times, without appearing to look, he had seen a brief flicker of movement from the ridge as the man changed position or eased his cramped muscles. "You'd never make a ranger," he muttered. Time and time again, he'd seen Halt and Will's uncanny ability to maintain a position without moving for hours on end. "Then again," he'd continued, grinning, "neither would I." He knew he didn't have the patience or the self-discipline that the rangers seemed to possess in large amounts. As the shadows began to lengthen and the sun dropped inexorably towards the horizon, he came to a decision. It would be logical for him to make a quick patrol of the area before dark. Such a move shouldn't rouse the Genovesan's suspicions if he was still there. Accordingly, Horace donned his mail shirt and helmet, buckled on his sword, and picked up his shield, and set out from the camp. He started towards a point on the ridge some 200 meters to the left of the Genovese's last position. From there, he would patrol in an arc along the ridge, checking the land to the south. He felt a little more secure now that he had the shield on his left arm. It would stop a crossbow bolt easily, and he had confidence in his own reactions. If the Genovesan were still in position, and if he rose to shoot, Horace would have ample time to take the bolt on his shield. And then, with the crossbow unloaded, he might just get within sword's length of the treacherous assassin. He'd quite enjoy that. He trudged up to the ridgeline, made a show of scanning the ground out to his left, then turned right and began to work his way along the ridge. He reached the spot where he had seen movement and looked carefully around. The grass had been depressed by the shape of something or someone lying there for an extended period. It was an ideal observation point. The ridge here was a little higher and gave a wider view of the land before it. He glanced back at the camp, seeing the smudge of smoke from the fire, blowing sideways and lying low to the ground in the freshening evening breeze, and the still form, wrapped in blankets, sleeping beside it. On an impulse, he strode down the far side of the ridge and scanned left and right. It only took a few minutes to find what he had been looking for. There was a fresh pile of horse dung in the grass, and evidence of where a picket stake had been driven into the ground, then removed. The Genovesan had tethered his horse here, back from the ridge and hidden from the campsite, but close enough if he needed to make a hurried escape. "He was here all right," he said, "and now he's gone. Question is, will he come back? And if so, when?" He trudged back to the camp, turning the problem over in his mind. As darkness fell, he prepared a meal. He shook Halt gently and was surprised and relieved when the ranger's eyes opened almost immediately. "Dinner," Horace told him. Halt gave a small snort. About time. Service around here is very slow." But he accepted the plate of food eagerly and ate quickly. After he had satisfied his immediate hunger, he held up a piece of the damper that Horace had cooked in the coals. "Did you make this?" he asked. Horace, with some pleasure in his new skill, assured him that he had. It didn't take long for Halt to burst his bubble. "What is it?" he asked. Horace eyed him for a long second. "I think I preferred you when you were sick." Later, when Halt was sleeping again, Horace banked the fire, then slowly withdrew from the uneven, flickering circle of light that it threw. There was a fallen tree some 15 meters away, and he sat with his back against it, a blanket wrapped round his shoulders, and his drawn sword resting ready across his knees. He spent a sleepless night watching for an enemy who never appeared. In the morning, the Genovesan was back.